In today's video, I am going to show you a fast Red Corsairs recipe you can use for army painting, as well as how to improve it for your characters. Red is notoriously difficult to build up smoothly, but with the right tool, you can skip a lot of that struggle entirely. For this, I'll be using a tool most of you are probably familiar with at this point, a makeup sponge. When working with a makeup sponge, I always recommend wetting it beforehand and squishing out most of the water until it's only slightly damp. I also mix a bit of water into the paint itself. This is done for two main reasons. The diluted paint, as you might imagine, keeps the layer thin and transparent. Therefore, it helps greatly in achieving those smooth, airbrush-like finishes that sponges are capable of producing on a budget. However, wetting the sponge itself is just as important, because it allows the paint we pick up to remain fresh for longer. Otherwise, you won't get more than 3 or 4 stamps on the model before the paint starts to dry out. In regard to the application itself, my aim is to work on the volumes the same way you would see someone do it with an airbrush. This would obviously be much easier if the model were unassembled and the arms, for example, weren't obstructing access to deeper recesses. However, I intentionally decided to work on the model fully built, since my goal here was to provide you with an army painting recipe that you can realistically use across multiple models in a reasonable amount of time. Because of this approach, whenever I encountered hard-to-reach areas, I simply take advantage of the black primer and leave those zones as if they were naturally in shadow. This might feel a bit strange right now, but trust me, once we start adding detail and pushing the colors, the viewer's attention will be drawn away from any lazy or rough areas. Even so, as you can see, I did cut my sponge into a smaller piece and using a pair of tweezers, continued sponging the volumes in tighter spaces. This was done both for comfort and precision. However, in a previous video where I worked on some space wolves, you can see just how far the pointed end of the sponge can be pushed without the need to cut it down at all. Now, I know I've been throwing around the term volumes without properly explaining it. In short, this refers to the way different shapes catch light. For example, a line highlight for cylinders or a circular highlight for spheres. However, to be completely honest, I didn't learn this through formal theory, and I don't expect you to either. I am certainly not going to pretend to explain it like a trained artist. Instead, I learned by studying references, and thankfully we have plenty of those available on social media. For now, just look at what we've achieved so far, which is very close to what most Space Marines typically look like at this stage. Now that the red armor is sponged in, we can move on to the rest of the base coats. And here there is only one major thing to point out, and that is to work with the side of the brush as much as possible. A fine tip and proper dilution, so the paint flows effortlessly from the brush, are definitely important. However, correct brush placement as shown here ensures that no matter how hard you press down, the paint will only touch the most raised details. This becomes extremely helpful not only when working on the chapter sigils, but especially when tackling the armor trim. And for the trim itself, there really is no magic trick other than patience, unless you are willing to sacrifice the red panel volumes we worked on earlier. In the past, I showed an alternative method for painting Chaos Space Marine that skips painting the trim altogether. However, that approach sacrifices the panels by leaving them looking much flatter. If you would like to check that out, the video will be linked in the description. For today though, let's continue working on this Red Corsair. Once all the other base coats were applied, which had to be done after the sponge work, since the sponge can be a bit messy and may stain surrounding areas, the next step is to create definition between the different elements of the model. This is especially important for tabletop readability, primarily between the red armor panels and the metallic trim. To keep things simple, I'll be using a black wash. However, I am diluting it 50-50 with its corresponding medium. In my case, Vallejo Black Wash mixed with Express Medium. This dilution reduces the amount of staining on the red armor, while still maintaining the fluid properties that allows the wash to settle nicely into the recesses. Applying a wash is fairly straightforward. There isn't much to it beyond covering the surface you intend to shade. However, there are a couple of important things to keep in mind if you want a cleaner result. On one hand, I strongly suggest working on one area, or in this case, one panel at a time. If you start on one section, move to another and then return to the first, the wash may have already begun to dry. Therefore, touching it again can leave unwanted marks or streaks. By focusing on a single area at a time, you ensure that you can properly move the wash around as needed and guide it exactly where you want it to settle. The second thing to watch out for is paint pulling towards the lower areas. This naturally happens when you work with diluted paints, especially washes. However, the solution is very simple. Rinse your brush, dry it slightly, and use it to wick away any excess paint you see collecting. My workflow usually looks something like this. Apply the wash to one area, move on to the next, but before moving to a third, quickly check the first one to make sure nothing is going wrong. Once the wash dries, we already have a perfect serviceable tabletop finish. And no, I am not worrying about edge highlights when talking about true tabletop standards. More often than not, highlights don't contribute much at actual gaming distance under your local game store's lighting. However, if you want to push this paint job further, whether for the whole army or just a character, let us take this base work to the next level. First, we need to look back at the red armor. Unfortunately, while washes are convenient for shading, it is unavoidable that they will slightly stain the raised areas even when diluted like we did. Therefore, using a quick stippling motion with a bright red, diluted 50-50 with water, I recreate the highlight volumes established earlier with the sponge, but this time adding a bit more texture, because let's be honest, no space pirate is running around with perfectly clean glossy armor. A bit of texture always helps in storytelling. At the same time, keeping the paint diluted ensures that these small dashes and dots don't overpower the smoother sponge work underneath. Instead, they build texture into the existing volumes rather than sitting harshly on top. But if you prefer a rougher, more battle-worn finish right from the start, you can simply swap the initial makeup sponge for a regular household sponge, which naturally produces a much more uneven texture. If you haven't seen that approach, you can check it out in last week's video. Once the armor was finished, you can clearly see how much the red pops, especially against the black recesses, which enhance both separation and contrast. But what comes next? Well, that depends on the model you are painting. I generally don't recommend highlighting every single detail. Instead, focus on the elements that define the miniature. In this case, that means the red armor panels and the metallic trim. For the trim, I once again use the side of my brush to catch only the raised edges and establish some sharp definition. I also used a sponge to create a few quick scratches on the axe. You will find a dedicated video on this technique linked in the description, but the process is simple. Unload most of the paint from the sponge onto your palette and maintain a very light touch while dragging it across the edge. Moving forward with the paint job, we've talked about pushing highlights on the defining elements. However, we should also look for opportunities to add something special that makes this particular model stand out. This won't happen on every miniature, but in this case the power claw is both visually imposing and the perfect place to do so. So in an effort to add some energy coming from within, I'll be using what I call the water trick. First, I apply a thin layer of clean water over the surface. After rinsing my brush, I introduce some diluted white paint, and because the surface is already wet, the paint naturally flows into the recesses and settles there. Afterwards, I repeat the process with a blue-green tone. The white base ensures the color placed over it reaches its full brightness. Once everything dried, I re-established the pure white around the energy source. And then applied a diluted turquoise wash towards the outer edges. This creates the impression of the white energy fading into blue tones across the claw. Even if your pin washing of the blue isn't perfect, a quick dry brush of metallic paint will clean up the raised areas, while leaving the blue tones visibly in the recesses, reinforcing the idea that the power is glowing from within rather than sitting on top of the metal. At this point, you might think we are done. However, if there ever is an opportunity to add a bit more color interest, I always like to take it. In this case, I am enriching in the metallics with a very light brown wash. This is dark rust acrylic paint diluted roughly 4 parts water to 1 part paint. But I am not trying to create heavy rust here. Instead, the goal is to introduce subtle grime and tonal variation. Something very light that won't steal the attention but will enhance the storytelling and add extra chromatic richness to the metal. The wash was applied very sparingly, and then, by mixing in just a small touch of orange, I selectively reinforced roughly half of the brown spots to introduce a bit more variety. Thanks for watching. I hope you found something useful here, and that this gives you a faster way to tackle your projects. If you enjoyed the video or it helped you out, a like and a subscribe are always greatly appreciated. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you'd like to see more content like this. And of course, if you have any questions, suggestions, or things you'd like to see covered in the future, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.